The packed courtroom
The
buzzed
sentence
with
of
a
the court
tense
said to be
energy,
imprisoned in the
a
state
heavy
correctional
mixture of
facility for an
grief,
aggregate term of
disbelief,
120
and
years.
simmering anger filling the air. Rows upon rows of seats were occupied by somber faces, family members of the victim, friends, neighbors, and townsfolk from Crestwood, all gathered to witness the trial that had shaken their quiet suburban town to its core. At the center of the storm was Jake Marshall, an 18-year-old whose youthful arrogance was as palpable as the weight of the accusations he faced. Before we dive into this gripping story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give us a thumbs up. We'd love to hear from you in the comments about your thoughts on this case and where you're watching from. Your engagement fuels our passion for uncovering these compelling narratives. Jake sat rigidly in the defendant's chair, his dark eyes scanning the crowd with a reckless confidence that bordered on defiance. He was convinced that his charm and youth would sway the jury in his favor. To him, the courtroom was just another stage, and he the star who would emerge unscathed. The whispers among the onlookers painted a different picture. A young man who had once been known as charismatic, popular even, yet troubled beneath the surface, coming from a family that appeared stable and supportive, but failed to see the cracks forming beneath Jake's polished exterior. The judge's gavel finally silenced the murmurs as the trial was called to order. The prosecution and defense teams prepared their opening statements, but all eyes remained fixed on Jake. His parents sat a few rows behind him, their faces etched with a mixture of hope and despair, unable to reconcile the boy they raised with the person now accused of murder. Outside the courthouse, Crestwood was a town grappling with the shock waves of violence. The streets that once echoed with the laughter of children and the hum of community life now carried a somber quiet. Jake's name was on everyone's lips, but the image each person held was conflicted. Some still clung to the boy they thought they knew, while others saw only the darkness that had erupted in that fateful summer night. Jake's belief in his own invincibility stemmed from a lifetime of being shielded by his looks and easy smile. He had never imagined that his impulsive actions would lead to such irreversible consequences. To him, this was a youthful mistake, a momentary lapse that the jury would understand and forgive. His mind replayed the night of the crime, filtering the events through a lens that cast him as more victim than perpetrator, more misunderstood teen than dangerous offender. As the courtroom settled, the weight of the moment began to sink in, not just for Jake, but for everyone present. This was more than a trial. It was a reckoning for a community that had believed in a bright future for its young people. Now, they were forced to confront a grim reality: the loss of Michael Hayes, a classmate, a friend, a promising young life cut short. Jake's defense attorney whispered reassurances, but beneath Jake's outward confidence, a flicker of doubt ignited. He was about to face not just a courtroom, but the harsh light of truth and the possibility that his carefully constructed facade of innocence might finally crumble. The night had started like any other summer evening in Crestwood. Warm air thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of cicadas. The streets were alive with the sounds of teenagers laughing, the faint thrum of music from open windows, and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. But beneath that ordinary facade, a storm was brewing that would shatter the fragile peace of the town forever. Jake Marshall had been out with friends, the energy of youth coursing through him, his confidence inflated by the glow of streetlights and the easy camaraderie of his peers. His mind was restless, a mix of teenage bravado and simmering frustration that he hadn't fully acknowledged until that night. The air was thick with tension long before the confrontation, a collision waiting to happen between Jake and his classmate, Michael Hayes. It began with a heated exchange, words sharp and cutting, fueled by grudges and jealousy neither was willing to let go. The argument escalated quickly, voices rising over the quiet neighborhood. Neighbors might have heard the shouting, but no one expected what would come next. A moment of chaos, a flash of movement, and then the brutal act, a knife thrust, repeated, until Michael lay lifeless on the pavement, the summer night darkened by blood. Jake stood over the body, his breath ragged, eyes wide with a mixture of shock and something darker, an unsettling calm that told a different story from the panic he would later claim. In his mind, the narrative was already forming. This was self-defense, a tragic accident born of fear and confusion. He was convinced that any rational jury would see it the same way, that they would understand the heat of the moment, the impulse of youth. Back at the scene, Jake's first instinct was survival, not remorse. To his friends, he downplayed the gravity of what had happened, masking the horror with a facade of bravado. He told them it had been a fight, nothing more, a stupid mistake that would blow over once the truth came out. His words were laced with a dangerous overconfidence, a belief that his charm and the town's sympathy for a young man's error would shield him from the consequences. But beneath that bravado, a tension simmered. Jake's mind raced to construct a story that could hold up under scrutiny. He rehearsed versions of events, each more carefully crafted than the last, confident that his narrative would be enough to sway opinion. He believed the jury would see him as a scared teenager, caught in an unfortunate situation, not a cold-blooded killer. As dawn broke over Crestwood, the reality of the night's violence began to seep through the cracks of Jake's carefully maintained illusion. The community, once united by shared routines and familiar faces, now whispered behind closed doors, grappling with the incomprehensible loss of Michael Hayes. For Jake, the night was supposed to be a turning point, a mistake to be forgiven, a chapter to close. Instead, it marked the beginning of a nightmare that would unravel everything he thought he knew about himself and his future. In the days that followed, as police began their investigation and news spread, Jake's confidence remained unshaken. To his family, he insisted the truth would come out, that justice would see him as the victim he claimed to be. But beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to form, small doubts, fleeting moments of fear that whispered of consequences far graver than he had imagined. Yet, in that moment, sitting under the harsh glare of the courtroom lights days later, Jake still clung to the hope that his youth and charm would be his salvation. The night of violence, horrific and irreversible, was to him a youthful misstep, a momentary lapse that the world would understand and forgive. But the shadow of that summer night stretched long, threatening to engulf everything he held dear. The flashing lights of the police cars cut through the early morning haze as officers descended on the quiet suburban street. Neighbors watched from behind drawn curtains, whispers rippling through the neighborhood like a restless wind. At the center of it all was the lifeless body of Michael Hayes, sprawled across the pavement in a pool of darkening blood, the brutal reality of the night's violence stark against the calm of the dawn. Jake Marshall sat on the curb, his hands trembling as the weight of the moment began to press down on him. His face was pale, the adrenaline that had carried him through the previous hours now ebbing away, leaving raw nerves exposed. When officers approached, his eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and defiance. He was visibly shaken, but guarded, his answers to initial questions hesitant, evasive even. The first moments of police questioning were a tangled web of conflicting stories. Jake's voice wavered as he recounted what had happened, his version shifting with each retelling. One moment, it was a scuffle gone wrong. The next, a desperate act of self-defense. His attempts to frame the incident as accidental were undermined by the inconsistencies in his narrative, raising red flags for the officers listening closely. Detectives exchanged glances, noting the discrepancies. They knew that beneath Jake's shaky demeanor was a story that did not add up. The calm, confident facade he had worn before was slipping, revealing cracks of uncertainty and perhaps guilt. The community, still reeling from the shock, struggled to reconcile the image of Jake, the boy they had seen as charismatic and troubled, but ultimately harmless, with the violent act unfolding before them. As word of the stabbing spread, the tight-knit community of Crestwood found itself suspended in disbelief. Parents worried about their own children. Friends questioned how someone they knew could be involved in such a tragedy. The local school became a hushed place, corridors filled with whispered rumors and stolen glances, the specter of Michael's death casting a long shadow over the familiar halls. Meanwhile, Jake's family grappled with their own storm. They had always believed in Jake's potential, turning a blind eye to his reckless behavior and volatile temper. Now, faced with the reality of the police investigation and the mounting evidence, they were forced to confront the possibility that their son was not the innocent teenager they had hoped him to be. Back at the police station, forensic teams began their meticulous work. The scene was carefully documented, evidence collected with clinical precision. Each detail chipped away at Jake's story, revealing a more deliberate and violent encounter than he had admitted. Blood spatter patterns, the angle of the wounds, and the nature of the attack painted a grim picture that contradicted the notion of a brief, accidental scuffle. Witnesses slowly emerged from the shadows. Neighbors who had heard the shouting came forward, describing a heated argument escalating into aggressive behavior. Friends of both Jake and Michael recounted earlier tensions, moments of hostility that hinted at deeper conflicts. Their testimonies added layers to the narrative, complicating Jake's claims and casting doubt on his portrayal as a scared teenager overwhelmed by circumstance. Despite the mounting evidence, Jake remained stubbornly confident. He believed the community's affection for him and his own youthful bravado would shield him from the harshest judgment. He clung to the idea that the jury would see his actions as a momentary lapse, a mistake made in the heat of passion rather than a calculated act of violence. But as the days passed and the investigation deepened, the facade began to crumble. Detectives pieced together a timeline that placed Jake at the center of a confrontation he had not left until it turned deadly. His contradictory statements, combined with forensic findings and witness accounts, painted a picture that was increasingly difficult to refute. The quiet streets of Crestwood, once symbols of safety and community, now felt like a cage closing in around Jake. The boy who had once believed himself untouchable was slowly realizing that the consequences of that night would reach far beyond the immediate moment. The community's shock and grief were transforming into a demand for truth and justice, and Jake's carefully constructed narrative was unraveling under the relentless scrutiny of the investigation. In the courtroom where the trial was set to begin, the tension was palpable. The prosecution prepared to lay bare the facts, the defense strategizing to salvage what remained of Jake's innocence. But the truth was already seeping through the cracks. Jake's conflicting stories, the forensic evidence, and the witness testimonies were converging into a damning portrait that would challenge every claim he had made. As the courtroom doors opened and the trial commenced, the community held its breath. The quiet boy from Crestwood was no longer just a troubled teen. He was a defendant facing the full weight of the law. And in that moment, the fragile illusion of innocence that Jake had clung to began to shatter, replaced by the grim reality of a night that had changed everything. Forensic reports arrived with chilling precision, each detail unraveling the version of events Jake Marshall had so confidently spun. The initial narrative of a brief scuffle, a momentary lapse in judgment, was dismantled piece by piece by the cold, unyielding facts of the investigation. Blood spatter analysis revealed patterns inconsistent with a simple defensive act. Instead, it indicated repeated, deliberate strikes, each one fueling a picture of intent rather than accident. The wounds on Michael Hayes's body were carefully examined by medical experts, whose testimonies would later become pivotal in the courtroom. They spoke of the sustained nature of the attack, the force behind each stab, and the unmistakable evidence that this was no impulsive act of panic. Their clinical words pierced the courtroom, painting a grim tableau that contrasted sharply with Jake's claims of self-defense. Witnesses, too, began to emerge from the shadows, shifting the tide of public opinion and legal scrutiny. Several neighbors reported hearing more than just raised voices that summer evening. Some described a heated, aggressive confrontation that escalated well before the fatal moment. One witness recalled seeing Jake's posture change from defensive to confrontational, the aggressive energy that sparked the violence. Friends and classmates who had once seen Jake as merely troubled now spoke of a darker side, moments of anger, threats, and a simmering resentment that had gone unchecked. Their testimonies added layers to the unfolding story, revealing a pattern of aggressive behavior that undermined the defense's portrayal of Jake as a scared teenager caught in unfortunate circumstances. Despite mounting evidence, Jake's overconfidence persisted. He remained convinced that his youthful charm and the community's lingering sympathy would tip the scales in his favor. This misplaced certainty led to careless mistakes, contradictory statements during interviews, inconsistencies in his timeline, and moments where his anger briefly surfaced, betraying the calm demeanor he tried to maintain. Investigators noted these cracks, sensing that Jake's belief in his invincibility was beginning to falter. They observed how his story shifted when confronted with new evidence, how his attempts to embellish or alter his account only deepened the suspicions around his guilt. Each misstep was a thread unraveling the carefully woven web of deceit that had sustained him since that fatal night. The community's shock slowly transformed into a demand for accountability. The parents of Michael Hayes, once hopeful for understanding, now braced themselves for a trial that would expose painful truths. Their grief was raw, their voices trembling as they prepared to testify about the loss that had shattered their lives. The weight of their sorrow hung heavy in the air, a stark counterpoint to Jake's bravado. As the trial approached, the defense struggled to maintain their narrative against the growing mountain of contradictory evidence. The prosecution's case was tightening, built on forensic science, credible witnesses, and the unraveling of Jake's story. The once confident teenager was now on the defensive, his overconfidence replaced by a palpable unease. In the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The judge's stern gaze swept over the assembled crowd, while the jury listened intently to the testimonies that laid bare the stark realities behind the tragedy. Jake sat with clenched fists, his earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet desperation, the facade of innocence crumbling with each new revelation. The forensic experts detailed how the nature of the wounds indicated a sustained attack, not a fleeting moment of panic. Witnesses painted a picture of escalating aggression, undermining Jake's claims of a brief scuffle. The community's faith in the boy they once knew was eroding, replaced by a growing conviction that the truth was far darker. Jake's mistakes were his undoing. His contradictory statements became focal points for the prosecution, each inconsistency a nail in the coffin of his defense. His attempts to manipulate the narrative only deepened the suspicion that he had planned or at least knowingly engaged in the violent act that ended Michael's life. As the evidence mounted, the jury's expressions shifted from confusion to grim understanding. The story that had begun with a moment of youthful impulsiveness was now revealed as a calculated and sustained attack. Jake's overconfidence, once his shield, had become his greatest vulnerability. Outside the courtroom, the community of Crestwood grappled with the harsh truths unveiled during the proceedings. The boy they had known, the troubled but redeemable youth, was now facing the reality of his actions laid bare for all to see. The fragile trust and innocence that had defined their town were forever altered, the shadow of that summer night casting a long and irrevocable darkness over their lives. Inside, as the day drew to a close, Jake sat silently, the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. The cracks in his story had become chasms, and the confident young man who had once believed himself untouchable now faced the stark reality of a justice system closing in. The facade was gone, replaced by the unvarnished truth, and with it, the beginning of a reckoning that neither he nor the community could escape. Surveillance footage had long been a silent witness to the truth, but now it emerged as the undeniable thread unraveling Jake Marshall's carefully constructed story. The grainy images, captured by a nearby convenience store's security camera, showed Jake's movements in stark detail, moments that contradicted every claim he had made to police and family. The video depicted him trailing Michael Hayes through the dimly lit streets that summer evening, his posture tense, purposeful. As investigators watched the footage frame by frame, a chilling realization took hold. Jake was not a victim of circumstance, but the initiator of the confrontation. The video captured the moment Jake approached Michael, the heated words exchanged, and the aggressive shove that ignited the violent clash. There was no sign of self-defense, only a deliberate pursuit that culminated in a deadly encounter. Faced with this irrefutable evidence, Jake's composure began to crack during subsequent interrogations. At first, he clung desperately to his original narrative, insisting the encounter had been accidental, that he had acted in fear. But as detectives pressed, the weight of the footage bore down on him, and his answers grew fragmented, evasive. His eyes darted nervously, his voice faltering as he struggled to reconcile the video with his fabricated story. Despite the mounting pressure, Jake refused to admit full responsibility, instead weaving partial truths and half-answers in a futile attempt to maintain control. The detectives, however, saw through the facade, their questions sharpening like knives, cutting through his defenses. The arrest came swiftly after the interrogation, the formal charges of first-degree murder laid against Jake marking a turning point in the case. The evidence was overwhelming. Beyond the forensic reports and witness testimonies, the footage painted a vivid picture of intent. The community, once divided in its sympathies, now faced the stark reality of the crime and the young man at its center. Jake's family was left reeling, caught between disbelief and the crushing weight of proof. They had held on to hope that their son's charm and innocence would protect him, but the video shattered that illusion. The neighborhood whispered in hushed tones, the shock giving way to a growing demand for justice. The boy who had once been the picture of youthful promise was now branded as a cold, calculating killer. In the days before the trial, the footage became a focal point of discussion among legal teams and community members alike. Defense attorneys scrambled to find ways to mitigate its impact, arguing for diminished responsibility based on Jake's age and emotional state. Prosecutors, meanwhile, built their case around the undeniable evidence of planning and aggression, determined to secure a conviction that reflected the gravity of the crime. Jake himself oscillated between defiance and despair. At times, he seemed convinced that his youth would spare him, that the court would see the impulsive nature of his actions and grant leniency. Other moments revealed a flicker of fear, the realization sinking in that the life he had taken and the path he had chosen might condemn him to decades behind bars. The town of Crestwood found itself polarized, torn between those who saw Jake as a misguided teenager deserving of a second chance, and those demanding the full force of the law for a life so tragically ended. The trial was set to become a battleground, not just of facts, but of emotions and moral reckoning. As the courtroom doors opened on the day of Jake's arraignment, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The prosecution presented the charges with unwavering resolve, while the defense framed Jake as a scared young man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control. But the surveillance footage hung over the proceedings like a specter, an unblinking witness to the truth. Jake's eyes flickered to the screen as the video was played for the jury, a stark reminder of the night that had forever altered the lives of two families and a community. The images left little room for doubt, and as the trial moved forward, the question was no longer if Jake was guilty, but how the court would weigh the evidence and decide his fate. In the quiet moments between proceedings, Jake sat alone, the gravity of the charges settling like a stone in his chest. The arrogance that had once shielded him was replaced by a growing sense of vulnerability. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The surveillance footage had changed everything, stripping away illusions and exposing the raw, unvarnished truth of a night shrouded in violence and regret. The courtroom hummed with quiet tension as the legal battle entered a new phase of relentless maneuvering. Behind the polished courtroom doors, Jake Marshall's defense team meticulously crafted a strategy designed to paint him not as a calculating murderer, but as a frightened boy overwhelmed by the gravity of his actions. They pushed hard for a plea deal, a manslaughter charge that would acknowledge the tragedy without branding Jake as a cold-blooded killer. They emphasized his youth, his lack of prior criminal record, and the emotional turmoil that had clouded his judgment that summer night. The defense argued that Jake's impulsive act, though tragic, was not premeditated murder, but a desperate response to escalating conflict. His attorneys portrayed a boy caught in the crossfire of adolescent emotions, overwhelmed by fear and confusion. They sought to humanize him, to shift the narrative from one of cold calculation to one of a momentary lapse, hoping to appeal to the jury's sense of compassion and understanding for a troubled youth. But the prosecution was relentless. Led by a seasoned district attorney known for her unwavering commitment to justice, they meticulously dismantled the defense's arguments, painting a starkly different picture. Their narrative was clear and uncompromising. Jake Marshall was a young man who had planned and executed a violent attack, driven not by fear, but by anger and resentment. They highlighted Jake's actions before, during, and after the crime as evidence of premeditation and callous disregard for human life. The prosecution's case was fortified by the mounting evidence, the surveillance footage showing Jake's pursuit of Michael Hayes, the forensic reports revealing the sustained nature of the attack, and the testimonies of witnesses who described Jake's aggressive behavior that night. They argued that these facts left no room for doubt about Jake's intent, asserting that this was not a tragic accident, but a deliberate and deadly act. Outside the courtroom, Crestwood found itself deeply divided. Some residents sympathized with Jake's youth, remembering him as a boy who had struggled but never seemed capable of such violence. They hoped for leniency, believing that a manslaughter plea might allow for rehabilitation rather than lifelong punishment. Others, particularly those close to Michael Hayes, demanded full accountability. They saw the prosecution's case as a necessary step toward justice for a life lost too soon. Local media coverage intensified the polarization. Headlines alternated between portraying Jake as a misguided teenager and a dangerous threat, fueling debates that spilled into homes, schools, and community centers. The trial became more than a legal proceeding. It was a mirror reflecting the town's fears, hopes, and fractures. Inside the courtroom, the defense faced mounting challenges. Key witnesses began to undermine their narrative, offering versions of events that conflicted with Jake's timeline and characterizations. A close friend, who initially provided an alibi for Jake, faltered under cross-examination, revealing inconsistencies that cast doubt on the defense's credibility. The prosecution seized upon these moments, sharpening their case and eroding the foundation of the defense's story. Jake himself oscillated between moments of defiance and despair. In private, his legal team counseled him to prepare for a difficult road ahead, warning that the plea deal might be his best option. But Jake remained stubborn, clinging to the hope that the jury would see him as a victim of circumstance rather than a perpetrator. His youthful arrogance, once a shield, now threatened to isolate him as the evidence mounted. As pre-trial hearings unfolded, the courtroom became a battleground of legal tactics and emotional appeals. The prosecution pushed for a full trial, confident in their case, while the defense sought to negotiate terms that might spare Jake the harshest consequences. The judge watched closely, aware that the decisions made in these preliminary stages would shape the course of the trial and the community's quest for justice. The families of both Jake and Michael Hayes navigated their own tumultuous paths. Michael's parents prepared for the emotional toll of witnessing their son's killer in court, steeling themselves for a fight to honor his memory. Jake's family wrestled with guilt and disbelief, torn between loyalty and the painful truths emerging from the investigation. Amidst the legal complexities, the human cost was ever present. The community grappled with the heartbreak of a life lost and the uncertain fate of a boy who had once been one of their own. The trial was no longer just about facts and evidence. It was about the fragile threads of trust, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption. As the trial date drew near, the tension in Crestwood reached a fever pitch. Conversations in homes and classrooms were colored by the unfolding drama, the lines between sympathy and condemnation blurring under the weight of grief and fear. For Jake Marshall, the coming days would test not only his fate in the courtroom, but the very essence of who he was and the legacy of a night that had changed everything. The courtroom was alive with anticipation as the trial of Jake Marshall finally commenced. The air was thick with the gravity of the moment, every seat filled with spectators eager to witness the unfolding of a story that had gripped Crestwood since that fateful summer night. The judge's gavel struck the bench, commanding silence, as opening statements began to carve the path the trial would follow. The prosecution rose first, their voice steady and resolute. They painted a stark, uncompromising picture of Jake, a young man who had pursued Michael Hayes with intention, whose actions were far from impulsive, and whose violent attack was a calculated act of rage. The prosecutor's words carried the weight of the evidence. Forensic reports, witness testimonies, and the damning surveillance footage. Each element was woven into a narrative that demanded justice for a life taken too soon. In contrast, the defense attorney approached the jury with a plea for understanding. They portrayed Jake as a frightened teenager, overwhelmed by the chaos of the moment and unprepared for the consequences of his actions. The defense urged the jury to consider the impulsiveness of youth, the emotional turmoil that clouded Jake's judgment, and his lack of a violent past. Their aim was to humanize Jake, to shift the focus from cold calculation to a young man's tragic mistake. As the opening statements concluded, the courtroom shifted to the presentation of evidence. Forensic experts took the stand, detailing the grim realities of Michael Hayes' injuries. Their clinical descriptions of the sustained, forceful nature of the stabbing contradicted Jake's claims of a brief scuffle, underscoring the prosecution's argument of intent. The jury listened, faces impassive, as the medical testimony laid bare the violence of that night. Witnesses followed, one after another, each adding a piece to the intricate puzzle. Neighbors recounted hearing raised voices escalating to aggressive shouting. Friends spoke of Jake's volatile temper and moments of anger in the days leading up to the crime. Their testimonies chipped away at the defense's portrayal of a scared, remorseful teenager, revealing instead a pattern of aggression and hostility. The highlight of the evidence presentation was the surveillance footage, replayed for the jury in stark, unedited clarity. The grainy images left no room for doubt. Jake was seen following Michael initiating the confrontation and escalating the encounter that would end in tragedy. The room was silent as the video played, the weight of its truth pressing down on everyone present. As the defense took the stand, cracks began to appear. A key witness, a close friend who had initially offered an alibi for Jake, faltered under cross-examination. Their testimony conflicted with Jake's timeline, casting serious doubt on the defense's narrative. The prosecution seized the moment, pressing hard to expose inconsistencies and undermine the credibility of the defense's case. Throughout the proceedings, Jake sat with a mixture of defiance and anxiety. His once confident demeanor was tempered by the relentless presentation of evidence and the erosion of the story he had clung to since the night of the crime. Each testimony, each piece of forensic data, chipped away at the facade, revealing a young man increasingly isolated in the courtroom. The community watched with bated breath as the trial unfolded. Friends and neighbors grappled with the stark realities laid bare in the courtroom, their perceptions of Jake shifting alongside the evidence. The prosecution's case was methodical and unyielding, while the defense's attempts to humanize Jake struggled against the tide of testimony. As the days wore on, the emotional toll became palpable. The victim's family prepared to share their grief, their voices trembling with the weight of loss. The defense scrambled to reclaim ground, but the mounting evidence and witness accounts tightened the noose around Jake's claims of innocence. The prosecution's narrative was clear and compelling. Jake Marshall was not a frightened boy caught in a tragic accident, but a young man whose actions were deliberate, whose aggression had escalated to deadly violence. The defense's portrayal of impulsiveness and fear was steadily dismantled, leaving the jury to confront the chilling reality of what had transpired. In the closing moments of the evidence phase, the courtroom was heavy with unspoken questions. The jury sat in silent contemplation, absorbing the testimonies and the stark visuals of the surveillance footage. The once vibrant and confident Jake was now a figure marked by uncertainty, his fate resting in the hands of those tasked with weighing the truth. As the trial moved toward its next phase, the community of Crestwood braced for the emotional and moral reckoning ahead. The story that had begun on a quiet summer night was now a public saga of loss, accountability, and the search for justice, a trial that would leave an indelible mark on all who witnessed it. Michael Hayes' parents took the stand with heavy hearts, their voices trembling as they faced the courtroom filled with strangers and familiar faces alike. Their grief was raw, palpable, a force that seemed to ripple through the room as they recounted the son they had lost, the boy with a bright future, a gentle spirit, and dreams now forever silenced by a violent act. Mrs. Hayes spoke first, her voice breaking as she described the devastating void left by Michael's absence. She painted a portrait of a compassionate son, beloved by friends and teachers whose laughter once filled their home. Her words carried the weight of a mother's loss, the ache of a future stolen, and the unbearable pain of a family shattered by violence. Mr. Hayes followed, his tone steady but laden with sorrow. He spoke of Michael's kindness, his promise to make a difference in the world, and the cruel finality of a life cut short. His testimony was not just a recounting of loss, but a plea for justice, a demand that the courts recognize the depth of the tragedy and hold accountable the young man responsible. Their statements transformed the courtroom atmosphere, shifting it from a sterile legal arena into a space charged with human emotion. Friends and neighbors who had come to hear the trial were visibly moved, many wiping away tears as the Hayes family's grief echoed through the chamber. The community's collective sorrow found a voice in their words, underscoring the magnitude of the loss they all shared. Others took the stand to share their memories of Michael, a kind-hearted friend, a loyal teammate, a young man full of potential. Their stories revealed a life vibrant and promising, now forever frozen in time. Each testimony added layers to the tragedy, making it impossible for the jury and observers to forget the human cost behind the case. Meanwhile, the community's response deepened. Vigils were held in Michael's memory, gatherings where neighbors came together to mourn and support the family. Schools held assemblies in his honor, reminding students of the fragility of life and the consequences of violence. The town's grief was collective, a shared burden that bound them in sorrow and resolve. In stark contrast, Jake Marshall's demeanor in court remained detached, his expressions often unreadable. His lack of visible remorse alienated many in the courtroom and beyond. Where the Hayes family's pain was raw and open, Jake's silence and occasional smirks fueled a perception of cold detachment, deepening the divide between defendant and community. This detachment did not go unnoticed by the jury or the public. Observers whispered about his seeming apathy, questioning whether he truly grasped the weight of his actions. His inability or unwillingness to express regret became a silent testimony against him, coloring perceptions and sowing doubt about his character. As the victim impact statements concluded, the emotional gravity of the trial reached a new peak. The courtroom, once filled with procedural formality, now bore the scars of loss and betrayal. The jury, confronted with the human faces behind the case, was left to wrestle not only with facts and evidence, but with the profound sorrow that underscored the proceedings. Outside the courthouse, the community grappled with mixed emotions: grief for Michael, frustration at the violence that shattered their peace, and uncertainty about what justice would look like. The trial had become a mirror reflecting their collective pain and the difficult questions about accountability and forgiveness. For Jake, the impact statements were yet another reminder of the irreversible consequences of that night. The testimonies stripped away any lingering illusions, forcing him to confront the depth of the suffering his actions had caused. Yet his demeanor suggested a disconnect, a barrier between him and the weight of the community's grief. As the trial moved forward, the emotional resonance of the victim's family and community testimonies lingered, casting a long shadow over the proceedings. The courtroom was no longer just a place of legal contest, but a stage where grief, loss, and the quest for justice intertwined, shaping the narrative that would guide the jury's ultimate decision. The prosecution's closing argument was a forceful crescendo, a meticulously crafted summation that left no room for doubt or mercy. The attorney's voice rose steadily, weaving together the threads of evidence, testimony, and unvarnished truth into a compelling narrative of cold calculation and deceit. The jury sat in rapt attention as the prosecution exposed Jake Marshall's pattern of lies, his manipulations, and the brutal reality of his actions. Every contradiction in Jake's statements was laid bare, each falsehood peeled back to reveal the stark truth beneath. The prosecutor recounted how Jake had pursued Michael Hayes that night, how surveillance footage proved intent, and how forensic evidence underscored the sustained nature of the attack. The narrative was unrelenting, leaving the jury with a clear picture of a young man who had chosen violence over reason, who had shattered a life with deliberate cruelty. But it was not just the physical evidence that the prosecution highlighted. They delved into the digital realm, presenting text messages exchanged between Jake and his friends in the days following the crime. The messages revealed a chilling awareness of the gravity of his actions, alongside a disturbing belief that he could evade justice. One message read, "I didn't mean to, but if I get caught, I'm gone." A stark admission of guilt, veiled in bravado. These private communications stripped away any pretense of innocence, painting Jake as a calculated actor who understood the consequences yet gambled on escape. The jury was urged to see beyond the facade of youth and charm, to recognize the cold reality of a mind that had chosen to deceive and manipulate. The prosecution's argument was punctuated by a detailed timeline, a methodical reconstruction of events that left no space for alternative interpretations. Each piece of evidence, each witness testimony, was woven into a tapestry of intent and responsibility. The narrative left the jury with a singular, inescapable conclusion. Jake Marshall was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense rose to deliver their rebuttal, a last-ditch effort to salvage the remnants of innocence. They appealed to the jury's empathy, emphasizing Jake's youth and the impulsiveness of adolescence. They portrayed him as a scared boy, overwhelmed by emotions he could not control, a young man deserving of mercy and a chance at redemption. But the defense's words rang hollow in the face of the prosecution's relentless case. The contradictions in evidence had eroded the foundation of their narrative, leaving little room for doubt. The jury listened, their faces impassive as the defense struggled to counter the weight of facts and revelations. As the closing statements concluded, the courtroom was heavy with silence. The jurors exchanged glances, the enormity of their task settling upon them. They were charged not only with deciding Jake's fate, but with weighing the complex interplay of youth, intent, and justice. The evidence was clear, their responsibility immense. Outside the courtroom, the community waited, holding its collective breath. The trial had exposed raw wounds and difficult truths, but now the moment of judgment was at hand. The jury's decision would resonate far beyond the walls of the courthouse, shaping the lives of those involved and the fabric of Crestwood itself. In the quiet moments before deliberations began, the gravity of the case pressed down on all present. For Jake, the facade of confidence had long since faded, replaced by a stark awareness of the consequences before him. The trial had stripped away illusions, leaving only the unvarnished reality of his actions and the lives forever changed. As the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom emptied slowly, the weight of the case lingering in the air. The community braced for the verdict, knowing that whatever the outcome, the shadow of that summer night would continue to cast its long, unyielding darkness over Crestwood for years to come. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating as the jury filed back in, their faces unreadable masks betraying no hint of the verdict they carried. Jake Marshall remained impassive, though beneath his calm exterior a storm of anxiety churned. The community of Crestwood held its collective breath. The weight of months of anguish and uncertainty culminating in this singular moment of reckoning. The foreperson rose, voice steady but heavy, with the gravity of the charge. We, the jury, find the defendant, Jake Marshall, guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder. The words echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap, reverberating against the walls and settling deep into the hearts of all present. A palpable wave of relief and devastation washed over the courtroom. Michael Hayes's family wept openly, their grief mingling with a tentative sense of justice served. The community, long fractured by shock and sorrow, began to find a fragile closure in the verdict. Yet for Jake, the weight of the judgment crashed down with unforgiving finality. As the sentencing hearing commenced, the judge's voice was solemn and resolute. He recounted the details of the crime, the impact on the victim's family, and the evidence of Jake's actions. The judge's words painted a stark picture of betrayal, not just of one life, but of the trust placed in youth and community. Jake was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a sentence that underscored the severity of his crime and the absence of remorse that had marked his trial. The courtroom was silent save for the judge's pronouncement, the finality of the moment sealing the fate of a young man who had once believed himself untouchable. As Jake was led away, a cold, unreadable smirk flickered across his face, a haunting reminder of the arrogance that had propelled him down this dark path. For the community, the verdict marked the end of a harrowing chapter, but the scars left behind would linger, a testament to the pain, betrayal, and shattered innocence that defined the tragedy. In the days that followed, Crestwood grappled with the aftermath, a town attempting to heal, to rebuild trust, and to honor the memory of a promising life cruelly cut short. The trial of Jake Marshall became a somber, cautionary tale, a reflection on the consequences of choices made in moments of darkness. For Michael Hayes and his family, the verdict brought a measure of justice, though it could never fill the void left by loss. For Jake, it was the beginning of a lifetime behind bars, a punishment befitting the gravity of a crime that shattered lives and forever altered a community's sense of safety and hope. The courtroom emptied, but the echoes of that summer night and the trial that followed would resonate far beyond its walls. The story of Jake Marshall and Michael Hayes would be remembered not just for the tragedy, but for the profound lessons etched into the fabric of Crestwood, a town forever changed by a night of violence and the pursuit of justice.